June of 1965. 6 young males managed to elude a rigorous Tonga boarding school, taking a modest fishing boat and pursuing an irresponsible dream of liberation at the ocean. They hardly had any supplies. Map without a true plan. Just assurance and interest. Days later, the Pacific removed both, leaving them shipwrecked on an isolated, deserted Ata Island. Is an island. What came next wasn't anarchy or brutality, but an remarkable cooperative experiment, self-control and long-term survival. Over a year, June 1965 saw the students at St. Andrews were boys college, a Catholic boarding institution located on Tongatapu, close to the capital, Alufanuku. They were teenagers, the boys whose bodies are expanding quicker than their judgment, whose thoughts oscillate between boredom and grandeur, whose feeling of importance is still based more on theory than reality. The Shaun Fataua, the oldest, was 16. Alongside him were Kolo Fekitoa, Stephen Fatai Latu, Mano Tadao, Shaun Felipe Tadao, and David Fatita Sola, the youngest, just 13. They were all from the windswept city of Hava Island, where hard work and salt air are acquainted. However, education had put pressure on them into an alternative form. Timetables, discipline, quiet, and the never-ending grind. Any instruction that seemed like a penalty for existing. Adolescent bitterness is a flammable fuel. A spark is all that is required. In this instance, the spark was a shared want to evade the schools, grasp, sneak off over the ocean, and land in a location that seemed to liberty. Perhaps Fiji or perhaps New Zealand. If there was a lot of wind and the ocean, choose to comply. It wasn't an particularly well-organized escape. That was a portion of its allure. The boys failed to set intended to be sad heroes. Their goal was to be momentarily, carelessly, uncontrolled. They were aware of whose boat they would board. Tananila was a local fisherman. Uhila, renowned for his grumpy disposition and the type of authority that kids refuse out of instinct. The boys didn't like him with the straightforward assurance of young people. On the day, early in the evening, when their strategy became clear, they took his whaling boat and made it easier. Beyond the harbor, nobody brought up an alarm. Nobody saw the tiny craft entering the open water with 6 boys on board and a load of gullible assurance. They carried 2 bags of a few coconuts, bananas, and gas burner. Only provisions that made sense if you thought of the ocean as a pond and the journey over a long weekend. They carried no map, no compass, no chart. Such a navigation plan depended on stars, luck, and the unconsidered presumption that the Pacific would collaborate. It did at first. The heavens were. The sea is manageable and clear. They set sail into the shadows using the electric feeling of breaking the law. And unchangeable. The air chilled at night. Their skin. The motion of the boat had a hypnotic beat. They fell one by one, sleeping. That choice, modest and common, human, almost killed them. There was a squall. Difficult. Rising, the sea slapped the boat with a violent lack of concern. The boys woke up to the sound of water smashing over their faces, to wind that sounded like something lively and furious. David, the youngest, thereafter made a joke about the older. He had been brought along by boys because he was the only person with sailing skills. However, at that time, knowledge wasn't sufficient. He tugged at the sail, and it was torn apart by the wind like paper. The rudder then snapped. Direction disappeared. The boat turned into rubble with travelers. They wandered for 8 days. There is a unique form of fear in being dehydrated in the sea. Water. Nothing to drink, everywhere. Their cuisine swiftly ran out. Their lips became parched and uncooked. They acquired the skill of observing the sky with the fervor of the desperate. When it began to rain, and it was stinging, they broke up coconuts and utilized their shells as raw cups, capturing whatever they could. Water was rationed with rigor. The priests would have been impressed. Returning to school. A single drink in the morning, 1 drink in the evening. Fishing, the clear solution, but it wasn't as clear in practice. The equipment they possessed was insufficient. The ocean declined to provide simple presence. Stripped of hunger and thirst them to the level of pure feeling. Sun, salt, nausea and the dull pain in the muscles. Clasped for too long. On the 9th day, a form emerged on the horizon. Within It appeared to be salvation in the distant. From a distance, it resembled an obstacle course of rock, cliff, and jagged coastline. The majority of Atta is mountainous, with its sides disappearing into a harsh, steep faces. There isn't a soft landing. A rival, but a geological dispute. The boys drove their boat's disaster onto the rocks and made the payment in cuts and bruises. The craft was destroyed. Separate. They were bleeding and bruised. But still alive. They needed about a day and a half to reach the shore completely. The people are not swiftly released by the water, even after it's finished with them. When they crept onto the island at last and fell because they were too worn out to felt anything but comfort, they investigated a cave to sleep in. Atta was not totally unidentified. It had a history as a scar. Long prior to these, when the lads arrived, residents had resided there. Family, a village, gardens, and poultry. Seasons and waves shape life. Next, the sea brought the violence. A slave. The population was ripped away by raids, and eventually, the island was deserted. Ruins stayed. Thus, a sort of haunting. Quiet. But the boys weren't contemplating the past. They were considering the current issue of not passing away. Stephen and Sione, the two oldest, assumed the role of leader with ease. Despite being in charge of an isolated island, is more about personality than proficiency and stability. One leaned in the direction of education, next steps, where to look, how to arrange the day. The group was anchored by the other, emotionally, leading them in the direction of prayer, reminding them that hopelessness was something they couldn't afford. They prayed collectively, not because prayer constructs shelters or locates water, but because it gives terror a form. They knew very little about the wilderness. Survival. They were raised in the Tonga's most populous orbit today. Island, with businesses and people all around. Routine. In the past, life seemed like a rumor. The island was unconcerned that they were pupils. It only cared if they were able to adjust. They discovered a tiny rock overhang and constructed a temporary bedding underneath it. It wasn't cozy, but it served as protection. The pressing issue was still water. They hollowed out trees to allow them to gradually fill their cavities with rainfall. As a makeshift cistern that required days to produce anything drinkable. The coconut aided, but not sufficiently. Desperation forces people to make decisions they've never envisioned. The boys ascended the cliffs in order to capture seabirds for more than just food. For hydration, consuming blood when water was rare. They consumed raw meat in the absence of fire. This is hard to romanticize. It was grim, instinctive, and essential. Flames turned into their preoccupation. Each day, they made an effort to attend. The technique was brutally straightforward. Wood versus friction. Wood, a laborious ritual, and disappointment. They dragged and scraped and massaged till their hands developed blisters, until smoke made fun of them, until hope blazed and perished. Then they repeated it. The following day, fire was more than just warmth and prepared food. Fire served as a signal, a pledge to any passing ship. They were not yet ghosts, as evidenced by fire. As the weeks stretched into months, another reality made its presence known. Being able to survive is simpler when you're not always at battle with those that are next to you. Naturally, they argued. There are 6 boys in. There will always be arguments in imprisonment. However, what sets this apart is what they did next. Tale from the well-known book. Every time, when tensions increased, they imposed penalties on oneself. They decided on timeouts, hours apart to chill off. They would stroll by yourself in the forest and weep if they had to, allow the rage to flow into wind and leaves, and then come back. The regulation was direct. The group was more important. More than pride. Harmony wasn't sentimental. Perfect. It served as a tool. Colorado, the musician, discovered wire fragments among the debris of the boat and mixed them with wood and a coconut shell to create an unrefined guitar. Evenings, when the light bled out of the completed product. They sang in the skies. They composed a song regarding the severe cliffs on the island and the loneliness that tormented them. Concerning the sense that time had stopped being medicated. Music didn't resolve their issues, but it maintained they are human. It provided them with a language for sorrow. About 6 months later, fire arrived at last. The initial flame needs to have appeared unattainable, akin to conjuring. Revitalization of dead substance. Just a moment. All that was present was fatigue and wood dust. Next, there was light, heat, and the dazzling flame-licking animal motion. Upward. The boys burst out laughing. It was almost hysterical in its sharpness. They understood right away that the fire was now their most prized asset. They fed it, protected it, and kept watch over it. It from the rain and wind. They constructed a little cover made of branches and leaves. Cautiously moved it inside after encircling it. Similar like bearing a baby. For the remainder of their time with Ada, they never let it to pass away. Eating became into a regimented activity. 4. To keep their bodies functioning, they required a consistent flow of seabirds, at least 2. Should supply enough beef for each boy each day. And pliable. It is risky to hunt on Ada. Labor. The cliffs are harsh and sharp. The wrong move could be the last one. One day, Stephen slipped. He landed on a thin ledge, his leg shattered. In a narrative that culminates in brutality, this is where the strong become burdens, the wounded. Keep your distance from the weak. On Ada, the boys behaved in the opposite way. They looked until they discovered him. They carried him, returning to camp with the cautious anguish of those who are aware that cannot spare anyone. They fixed the bone as much as possible and split it with branches, securing it. Next, they took up his workload without grievance. Stephen rested for months and mended while the others pursued and cared for, brought water, used fire, and carried out the grinding effort to remain alive. When he eventually standing once more, the entire thing was a victory, collectively owned. Meanwhile, the island held surprises. As they continued to explore, they arrived at the top of one of the flat, climbed mountains and found ruins. The remnants of the former community, abandoned a long time ago. There, they discovered plants that could be used as food, yucca and other veggies, and the majority of, amazingly, chickens, offspring of birds abandoned by the disappeared villagers. They had grown into a wild populace. The boys started capturing them at night, transforming it into a game to lift their spirits from collapse under normal circumstances. In the end, about 200 chickens were penned. They received eggs from birds, a trustworthy source of protein that didn't necessitate taking a cliffside living. They attempted to protect the herd by slaughtering and consuming a chicken only when the weather permitted. Hunting seabirds is too risky. They acquired the ability to think about systems, not only what they were eaten today, but what would provide them with food the following month. At some point, they constructed a raft and tried get away. The strategy made sense in the narrow logic of desire. Anything could be preferable to waiting. However, they still had no map, no compass, no real knowledge of currents. The raft collapsed, separated by about a mile offshore. They went swimming back, worn out and chased. It might have kept them safe. The sea that had almost killed them while they were still waiting. After a year had gone by, hope had altered texture. It had lost its brightness. And urgent. It was more subdued and quit. They started behaving like humans who could be present at UTA for the remainder of their existence. They constructed more durable shelters. They brought the old gardens back to life. They discovered close to the remains. They split up tasks in pairs, always in pairs, thus no one was alone for a long time, and nobody carried a load by themselves. They retained timetables. They worked out every day, conscious. Because being lazy is a gradual surrender. They created a poor mitten court and held competitions as though the game's rules might bring order to a world that has become essentially unruly. Throughout one investigation, they discovered human bones. Remains of an elderly guy, possibly one of the final person to stay on Ada after everyone else. Otherwise, they had either escaped or were taken. The boys collected the bones and offered the man a funeral service and burial. They prayed for both themselves and him. They demanded dignity even in exile. Beyond the cliffs of Ada, however, life went on. Ships went by unconcerned. Families grieved. The boys on Tongatapu were thought to be dead. There were funerals. Communities experience grief when nothing further needs to be done. September. A man by the name of Peter Warner was at sea on a ship known as the Just. David Warner was youthful, aspirational, and committed to creating a life that did not blended in well with his family's expectations. He was coming back from. When the righteous David came over, Tonga. Oda, one of his crew members, believed he heard a human voice. Warner wrote it off as seabirds, but decided to go closer. Take a look. Warner watched the ship get closer. Observed signs of fire, including scorch marks. Fires are rare on these islands. Begin by chance. The suggested markings. Purpose. They recommended individuals. Warner initially kept his distance. He had heard reports of runaway prisoners stranded on islands. Narratives intended to maintain. Sailors are wary. Then all of a sudden, 6 figures emerged, diving into the swimming in the sea in the direction of the ship with frenzied intent. They had lengthy hair. Their clothing had been worn away by salt, time, and the sheer fabric's impracticality in that surroundings. They must have appeared crazy. However, nothing wild was present in their behavior, just a sense of urgency. They arrived at the ship and had a clear conversation with Warner. In English. They informed him that they had been absent for over a year. They were unsure about the precise duration. They had been keeping track of days on a slate back at their camp. Afterwards, it would be found that they were only 2 days. Following such turmoil, the accuracy is almost unbelievable. Warner broadcast Tonga with the information he had discovered. Ada was attacked by 6 boys who said they had fled out of school. On the opposite end of the queue, there was quiet, and then feeling. According to reports, the operator's voice broke. The boys had been abandoned for deceased. There had been funerals. If this was a miracle, and it was true, Warner returned them to Tongatapu. Comfort ought to have been the conclusion. It's wasn't. The fisherman Tananila Uhila, whose boat they had stolen, had not forgotten. The law is frequently more interested in context than in categories, and theft was theft. The boys were detained and sent in jail. Warner, faced with the ridiculousness of penalizing boys who had made it through 15 months on a deserted island, made the decision to step in. He came up with a scheme. He would assist in creating a documentary regarding their tale and utilize the money raised for the boat that was pilfered. He made the payment. The boys were set free. Families were brought back together. Parents held sons who were already lamented. The lads were evaluated by doctors and were shocked not merely because they were living, but Stephen's leg, placed on a island perched on a rock with branches and Faith, had recovered with little more than a scar and complete functionality. It was a tiny medical miracle created by technology, but with caution and endurance. Just a few weeks after being saved, the boys went back to Ada with Warner to record the documentary. The island that had almost killed them had also, oddly enough, brought them up. In 1966, the documentary was broadcast on Australian television. Warner was hailed as a hero, and he was granted permission to fish in Tongan waters from Talfa Tupo for King, an official prize for a deed that started with interest in scorch marks. Years. The boys were dispersed throughout the map. Colorado. Fekitoa passed away in 2017 at the age of 71. Others created lives abroad in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, bearing with them a myth-like tale, but has the tenacious quality of reality. The coconut guitar was retained by Colorado. The melody. Their writings on Ada did not disappear. It's endured like a stone footprint. Ada itself is still unoccupied. The island's previous inhabitants were ripped away by the land, and violence never fully regained its population. The castaways in their documentary conveyed the optimism that Tongans may come back sometime and repopulate Ada instead of the lads who are stuck there, consuming seabird blood, but as a community deciding to relocate there. As of right now, that hope has not turned into actuality. The cliffs are intact, the destroys the weather while the island waits, apathetic and patient, the manner in which islands do, and that is the unpleasant reality. At the middle of this tale, the boys were not spared by turning into monsters. They refused to be saved. They produced rules when they were not compelled to. They cared to the wounded. They parted ways when furious instead of becoming worse. They collaborated in pairs. They worked out, they sang, they sustained a fire for several months. And months. Not because it was romantic, but because they were aware of that Seldom is survival a single act of heroism. Every day, the choice to survive is made. To carry out the unglamorous task. Collect water, fuel the flame, and make sure keep your hands occupied, pal, so your mind doesn't turn against you. If you are looking for a lesson, the clear one is that people are not as bad as we think. However, it could be more difficult to absorb a deeper lesson. Savagery is not inevitable for us, nor are we promised civility. What we develop into under duress rests on our decision to construct when nobody is around. What regulations we create, what obligations we acknowledge, the stories we tell ourselves in the shadows when the sea is past the cliffs, still howling. Regarding Ada, 6 boys repeatedly decided to construct a little society made up of nearly nothing. And more than anything else, bloodbath on a mythical island is what should cause us to pause and gaze. If you felt that this tale had the same impact as we did, give the video a moment of your time. It significantly increases the channel's audience. Individuals. Additionally, if you like actual stories that contradict what we believe to be true concerning human behavior, survival, and the edge between chaos and order, sign up to the channel. There are plenty others. Such tales are just waiting to be shared.